and I'll be talking on this topic today. I have a confession to make right off the bat that this is my first webinar, so please be gentle with me. I'm trying to sort it out as I go. First, I'll start by telling you a little bit about me and how it is that I ended up here. Excuse me. I've worked for a disability organization for about 17 years, and 5 years ago, I was invited to work on an OVW grant, the Office on Violence Against Women, to look at the intersection of disability and sexual violence. And my eyes were opened through that process, and a lot of this information has come out of that process of me holding panels and focus groups and talking with people with disabilities. I currently work at a place called the Association for Community Living. It is the ARC of Boulder and Broomfield counties, and we provide advocacy services for people with disabilities. There's ARCs all across the state of Colorado, so you can always Google it and find the ARC nearest you if you do feel like you need some assistance in terms of advocacy for people who have disabilities. So I just want to give you a quick rundown of what we're going to discuss today. I tend to go a little long, unfortunately, but I'm going to do my best to keep this presentation to an hour, and hopefully we can hit all of these things. This presentation is a condensed version of what is usually a half-day workshop, so it's going to be very much on the surface, just making sure that you get the whole picture, that you get the scope of everything that is entailed in this particular topic. And if you're interested in further trainings, then you can let me know and we can go in more depth about some of these topics. So primarily, I want to build a foundational understanding of developmental disabilities for the audience. And then I really think that critical thought and checking our assumptions is the very first step in us beginning to change the system and change a lot of things that are happening for people with disabilities. People with disabilities are ostracized in our community, so I think a lot of us have subconscious assumptions about them, and it is my intention in this presentation to really address those and maybe highlight and bring some self-awareness for all of you listening. And then the important part, and I think the reason that I always check into webinars, is to acquire some tools to better serve and support people who have developmental disabilities at your respective agencies. So I hate to tell people things that they already know. So I have a quick poll, and Josh, you can go ahead and start that poll for me, just to kind of see who's in this virtual room and make sure that I'm not, preaching to the choir, so to speak. So I'll let you guys take a few minutes, and I'll talk, while you're completing that poll, I'll talk a little more about how you would contact me for any additional trainings that you might need. I have my email address at the beginning and end of this. If you're anywhere within a 2 hours drive of Boulder, Colorado, then I could come and give live trainings. I also would have some opportunities for other webinars that possibly will be coming up again in 2018 with CCASA, and we're working on some webcasts that you can access at any time. So if this is something that at the end you think that your organization would benefit from going more in depth, then please contact me and let me know. All right, it looks like the poll is complete, and Josh is sharing the results. I can't see them on my screen, so I'll trust the little box that says that you can see the poll results. Josh, I wonder, for my information, if you could tell me what those results are.
Absolutely. So we have 61% at rape crisis or domestic violence centers, 10% at disability agencies, and 24% government agency, and 4% school systems.
Great, that is good news for me because I know a lot about disability, and that's what I was planning on talking to you about. So I hope that makes a steep learning curve for you guys. How about the second poll, Josh? Another intention I have with putting polls in the beginning is it lets my nerves settle a little, and I think that we have accomplished that. So thank you for taking time to do these. All right, Josh, you got to be my reporter again.
Yes. For the question, I am close with a person who has a disability. We have 52% saying yes, 25% saying no, and 23% saying not sure.
That's great. That 23% of not sure, we're actually going to talk about that in the presentation, about the idea of a hidden disability and how it's not always obvious. So something that I do at the beginning of every presentation is I talk to you about my assumptions and my filters that I am speaking to you through. I think that, again, this self-awareness piece is critical in us really starting to change the system and change ourselves. So I'm going to pseudo quickly run through this list and explain what I mean. In the 80s, there was a special educator named Anne Donnellan, and she coined the term the least dangerous assumption. And what she meant by that was she was in her teaching special ed classes, and she noticed that whenever students would be identified as needing special ed services, that the curriculum became different for them. And ultimately what that meant is that the bar that originally was set high in the mainstream classroom then was lowered based upon a child having an IEP or having a disability. And what she noticed is that the longer that kids were in the classroom, in the special ed classroom with a lower bar, the lower their test scores became, the less they achieved, the less they learned. So she came up with this term, the least dangerous assumption, to mean that regardless of what feedback we're getting from a person, regardless of if they have a visible disability or not, we should always leave the bar high, because there's no harm in that. There is harm in lowering the bar and taking away opportunities for people that would have been afforded to them if they'd not had a disability. So based upon that knowledge and reading her research about this, I came up with this list of assumptions. And for those of you that don't have a lot of contact with people with developmental disabilities, some of these things may seem pretty obvious to you, and you may wonder, why is it even on the list? But having worked in the field for 17 years, I can say I'm the prime candidate that have been guilty of assuming the opposite of this based upon somebody's different communication style, or if they don't use words to communicate, or if they don't have the ability to use their limbs in any type of way. So the ability to communicate is the very first thing that I always assume about every person with a disability. Even if they don't use words and they don't use sign and they don't have a talk box, I've met people who, with the expression on their face or the way they shift their eyes to one side whenever you ask a question, everybody is communicating with behavior at every single moment, regardless of using words or not. Everybody has the ability to learn. Test scores, I think we live in a culture where test scores mean a lot to us. We have IQ tests, we have our SATs, we have our ACTs. I mean, the list goes on. And so if you fall into that subset of people that your test scores come back as low, it's very easy to quickly assume that this person doesn't have the ability to learn new skills, doesn't have the ability to achieve what others have achieved, and it's simply not true. Everybody has the ability to comprehend their environments, again, regardless of what feedback we're getting from them. Every person has opinions and preferences. This is one that it gets a little tricky when you work in the disability service world. If somebody's opinion and preference is they want to eat pizza every night, it's difficult to find a way to respect that and acknowledge that that is a true opinion and preference and help somebody also learn different skills. I can say for myself, I've had a week where I have eaten pizza every night and nobody was there to tell me to stop. Everybody has complex emotional lives, regardless of what your cognitive abilities are. Everybody has a rich internal emotional life, and we should always assume that regardless of what we see. Everybody can feel love the same way. Everybody feels anger the same way. It's pretty common in the disability service world that our day-to-days, we start to dismiss the emotional experience of people with disabilities. We start to think, if you can't add 10 plus 12, then how can you feel love just as strongly? And that's just simply not true, that every single person has a complex emotional life. Likewise, every person has a desire for intimacy. This bullet point actually used to say for romantic relationships, and we changed it because maybe not everybody does want to have a romantic relationship, but everybody wants to have intimacy in some way. There's a woman that I know that every Friday night, she puts on her red prom dress. She can still fit into her prom dress, even though she is 30 years old now. And she sits down and she watches rom-coms and texts back and forth with her friends. And that is her idea of feeling beautiful and feeling intimate and having this romantic idea for herself. But it doesn't look like what we typically would imagine intimacy or romantic relationships might be, but that doesn't make it any less valid. Similarly, everybody has a desire for friendship. Everybody has the desire for dignity and privacy. This is one of the bullet points that you probably assume, of course, you would think that about every person. But whenever you add in the physical disabilities that come along oftentimes with developmental disability, that means that some people have staff doing things like changing their adult diapers in the middle of the day when they're in the mall. And our world, our society isn't exactly set up for people with disabilities. So that means that you might be a 50-year-old man who is exposed in a bathroom because the staff has to change your depends during that time. And it's very easy as the staff person to, in some ways, be traumatized, definitely be desensitized to this action, and forget that the person who is 50 and uses a wheelchair still has the desire for privacy and dignity about their body. Everybody values their culture, again, even if people don't communicate with words, and they come from a culture with a Spanish-speaking background, with a family that speaks Spanish at home. But this person specifically does not use words to communicate. It's, again, easy for us to forget that that language and that culture might be important to them because we think, oh, well, they're not using words, so it doesn't matter if we speak Spanish or English. And it does matter. It's part of who you are. It's how we build our identity, and we should always check in and be aware of the culture of every single person. And this is the trickiest one that I can give entire presentations on, is that all people are sexual beings. This is something that we have seen. It's a phenomenon over the history of man, that we assume if somebody has a physical disability or a developmental disability, in some way that diminishes their sexuality. And having led a lot of sexual expression groups and relationship classes, and currently leading an LGBT disability group, I can say that I've heard a lot of personal experiences that say that this is true, that every single person is a sexual being in one way or another. This is a quote: "Handle them carefully, for words are more powerful than atom bombs." This is a quote that I use to start talking about another filter that I'm speaking to you through, that you'll probably notice that I'm saying people with disabilities. That's my attempt to use the best practice, to use my language to show respect for people with disabilities. There's this philosophy called Whorfianism. I kind of get nerdy and geek out on some of this kind of stuff. It's the Sapir-Whorf theory, that the way that we use language and the way that we've learned even to use syntax and the way that we use vocabulary or organize our words in a sentence literally organizes the way that our neurons are firing in our brain, the way that our synapses are connecting. The neural pathways are made deeper by the way that we use language. And so it's pretty common that whenever, if somebody is corrected to say, you shouldn't use that word, that's offensive, and people often dismiss that, kind of, it's fine. They know that I don't mean anything by it. But it doesn't matter if you don't mean anything by it. Your brain is still wiring that way. And by using that language out loud that is disrespectful, you are also wiring other people's brains. So you take that idea, it's the real science, the neurobiology behind how we use language. And if you flip it over, then you can find that very easily you can become an activist and you can become an advocate simply by speaking respectfully and using language that has dignity for people with disabilities. And there's two different models that you can use to do that. The first is the most commonly known, person-first language. This was promoted by the ARC, actually, ARC of United States, in the early 90s. And it was in response to our mass media even, and school districts and different government agencies using a lot of pejorative language to talk about people with disabilities. So person-first language emerged. And to put it very simply, the name pretty much says what it is, that you speak about the person before you speak about the disability. So you are a person with a disability, not a disabled person. And then, as language does, things shift and things gain connotation and people have different perspectives about it. And about a decade after person-first language became the best practice for professionals who work with people with disabilities, a lot of advocacy groups, primarily deaf culture and the autism community, they started to look at the way we were using person-first language, and they said, if we're putting disability last, it seems like we're trying to put it in the shadows. It seems like we are saying that it's something to be ashamed of rather than an inherent part of our identity. And if you look at other subgroups, that is true. We don't say a person who is gay, we say a gay person. And so there's now these proponents out there for using identity-first language. And again, it is primarily from deaf culture and the autistic community, which then gets confusing, because how do you know when you meet a person and they have a disability, how do you know if they subscribe to person first language or identity first language? And how do you not offend someone? And this is, you know, the fear I think we all walk around with all the time every time we open our mouth is, gosh, I hope I don't offend someone. And so there are some best practices that you can use that doesn't matter if it's identity first or person first language. And here they are. Only mention the disability if it's relevant. For example, if somebody tells you a joke and you want to retell that joke later and you're sharing the experience and that person had a disability, it's not necessary to say, I know this guy and he has Down syndrome and he told me this really funny joke. You just know a guy and he told you a really funny joke. So think about whenever you are mentioning disability, are you mentioning it to point out that this person is different? Are you mentioning it because it is relevant for the conversation? Emphasize abilities rather than challenges. This comes up most often with whenever we talk about communication styles. So in the work that I do, it's pretty often that we'll get reports that say that this person is nonverbal, but nonverbal isn't actually helpful to me. It's not telling me how do I communicate with this person. So instead, flip it over and think about what is this person doing rather than what are they not doing. So in that example, you could say this person communicates through vocalizations, or this person communicates by shifting their eyes to one side, rather than just telling me the mainstream thing that they don't do. Describe structures as accessible. I have this friend who, it's relevant, uses a wheelchair and he drives. And every time we're going to the store and we go by a parking spot that has the sign, the old school sign that says handicap parking, he tells really kind of goofy, geeky jokes. And he's like, that parking spot doesn't look handicapped to me. It looks just fine. And then we'll drive by another spot that has potholes. And he's like, now that is a handicap spot. And I think that it's a very clever and silly way to talk about how even throwing that word handicapped out there when you're talking about structures is in some ways making it, again, a pejorative term. And so whenever you're talking about bathrooms or ramps or buildings or parking spots, you can use the word accessible. Avoid referring to groups based on their disability. This happens pretty commonly whenever we just talk about people who have disabilities, that we talk about disabled people or the disabled. And so if you are lumping everybody together based upon one characteristic, that is a flag to you to consider for a moment, why are you using language in that way? And this is a tricky one. Whenever you are trying to point out a relevant difference between someone who has a disability and someone who does not have a disability, I think a lot of people get really tripped up on this and out of best of intentions. And oftentimes you hear things like, well, they're normal. Well, I don't mean normal, they're typical, or they're able-bodied. And you can avoid all of those things by simply applying the similar type rule, that it's a person with a disability and it's a person without a disability. And the last is to avoid sensationalizing or giving excessive praise. This happens a lot in the media. There's a really good TED Talk out there that I don't have time to show you because it's, I think, 10, 15 minutes long. But her name is Stella, and I can't remember her last name right now, Stella Young. And she talks about her experience of people using sensationalizing disability to inspire the masses, to say like, oh, well, look at this person who doesn't have use of their arm and they're doing this great thing. And so you should feel better about yourself. And it's just a different way of objectifying somebody based upon a difference. So whenever you are working with or talking to or interacting with people with disabilities, avoid sensationalizing and congratulating them and telling them that they're brave, because they're just living their life the same way that you are. And then this is a test for me. I've tried videos a couple times. Hopefully this works for you. It might be a little choppy, but I think it will keep up with it. This is a group of people who have Down syndrome who are explaining why it's important to not sensationalize.
People with Down syndrome have special needs. Special needs? Really? It would be special if people with Down syndrome needed to eat dinosaur eggs. That would be special.
One dinosaur egg. Enjoy.
Yeah, you were totally right about Lindsay.
If we need to wear a giant suit of armor. That'll be special.
I got a condo in Manhattan. Baby girl, what's happening? So don't get to clapping.
It would be special if we needed to be massaged by a cat. If we needed to be woken up by a celebrity.
Wiki, eggs and bacon. Where are you? You may know me from Scrubs or Office Space. A few darker flicks, The Rock, Platoon, Wall Street. Funny story, I played Beth. My bad.
That would be special. But what we really need is education, jobs, and opportunities. Friends, and some love. Just like everybody else. Are these needs special?
All right, before I launch into the next section, I'm curious, Josh, just for my information for future videos, did that work out okay?
Yes, it worked wonderfully.
Great. I'm happy to hear that at least you saw it. So, all right. So that was the longest intro ever. I realize now that I need to speed things up to wrap this up on time for you guys. So some of the things that I think are just important to note, and we can go into deeper at a later time if you're interested. I might just quickly note them and move on. So please do stop me if you have any questions. I welcome questions. I usually present in more of a live fashion, and so I really appreciate that back and forth. So if you have questions or even comments or even disagreements, please just stop me and let me know. All right, so now we're getting down into just very simply the basics of what is a developmental disability. We, I think whatever our field might be, we tend to throw around jargon and forget that jargon is just that, and it doesn't exactly make sense to the general population. So I'll do my best to demystify it. IDD is the shorthand that we say for intellectual developmental disability. This is a fairly new combination of words that we use to refer to a certain group of people that we've been using for maybe the last 4 or 5 years. So developmental disability, without the intellectual part, just developmental disability is an umbrella term that underneath it falls everything else that has to do with your behavior, your adaptive behavior in the world. So if you have an intellectual disability, which used to be known as MR, if you have autism, if you have Down syndrome, all of those things fall under the giant umbrella of developmental disability. Intellectual disability, formerly known as MR, also falls under that umbrella. So it's that kind of idea that a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square, is that idea with intellectual versus developmental disability. So how do you determine what is an intellectual developmental disability? The state of Colorado last summer, 2 summers ago, they changed the rules. They used to determine developmental disability based on IQ scores. But any of us who have ever taken an IQ test as an adult or remember it as a child know that those scores really don't reflect who you are, how you behave in the world, even remotely. So Colorado took a very proactive step and instead started to look at adaptive behavior screenings. And what that means is that they have certain screening tools that they use to look at things like, are you able to access recreation? What do you do when you go shopping? Do you have money management skills? Can you tell time? How do you need assistance in communicating to other people? And all of similar things to what you see on this list. And then if you have delays in a certain number of areas, then you're determined as having an intellectual disability. The most common disabilities are intellectual disability, as I've talked about, cerebral palsy, which often is called CP, and then autism spectrum disorders, which Asperger's is now included in the autism spectrum disorders. These are the most common, the most likely that you would probably encounter through the context of your work or in your personal life. There are some other fairly common disabilities. And the pictures here are demonstrating what we call a phenotype, that with a certain type of disability, sometimes there is a physical phenotype, meaning just a set of characteristics that make it visibly recognizable that this person has a disability. So at the top of the screen, I'm going to use my tool. I hope this is useful for you guys. So here at the top of the screen is the phenotype of Down syndrome. This is the phenotype of Prader-Willi syndrome, and this is the phenotype of Williams syndrome. They all have different characteristics that tend to go along with it. And I think one of the dangers of having a type of disability that has physical characteristics that are similar to other people that have that same type of disability is that it becomes a really slippery slope for us to then assume that all of these people are very similar, that all people who have Down syndrome are, one I hear pretty often is happy, or all people who have Williams syndrome are really good at music. And so whenever you have that physical characteristic, I think you're probably even more susceptible to being lumped into a category. There's also some pretty common co-occurring physical considerations that it sounds like a lot of you are working in rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters or centers. So these are things that you would probably need to be aware might exist whenever you're supporting a person who has a disability, simply because they can quickly become crises if you're not aware to check in with somebody about these physical considerations. There's a really common, a high co-occurrence of epilepsy and seizures. Epilepsy and seizures don't always look like what you see on TV. We see what are called tonic-clonic seizures, where people convulse and fall down. Most commonly, the seizures would be absent seizures, where a person's eyes might shift to one direction. I worked with a guy once that he looked like he was going to sneeze, and that was him having a seizure. So this is important if you're interviewing someone or asking them questions and they seem to just check out, get curious about it and don't assume that they're just not paying attention. They might have something else physically going on. Very commonly, people use oxygen. This is particularly relevant for people who have Down syndrome, simply because of the way that their hearts are formed whenever they're born. So this is important if you're getting somebody out of a dangerous situation and they use oxygen, to make sure that the oxygen tank is full. Anytime before we take anybody out to a day program or to any community activity, we always check and make sure oxygen levels are full. Communication, there's very often different types of talk boxes. Some are called the Dynavox. It's a very large box, but most often it is an iPad these days with certain software installed on it. So if somebody is not communicating through words, ask them or somebody with them if they have an alternative communication device that they should bring with them in order to be more independent. G-tube is a different way of feeding for people that aspirate a lot, often have gastrointestinal tubes put in. And so make sure that if you see that somebody isn't eating and they've been out of their house for a while, check and see if there's any assistance that they need. Mobility is an obvious one. We'll talk about that more later with wheelchairs, walkers, things like that. And then medications. I think sometimes, unfortunately, and sometimes fortunately, people with disabilities tend to be on a lot of medications. And some of them are for physical considerations and some are for other behavioral type considerations. So regardless, you don't want someone to leave their home without their medications. So check in with somebody and just know that there might be a very large group of medications that might be needed. I think I'm going to skip this slide for the sake of time. You'll get this information though, and there's actually a statistics handout that I'm sending as well. I'm going to skip this slide because all of the statistics are different. And I think I've heard someone say before, 63.2% of statistics are made up on the spot. And I think that's whenever we look at the stats for people with disabilities, that's what we tend to see in the research, is that we don't really know. In the United States and across the world, we can reasonably estimate that 1 in 65 people has a developmental disability. And I think that number is surprisingly high for someone that doesn't interact with people with developmental disabilities on a regular basis. You might be surprised to see that number. So why don't we know? Why is it very hard to tell who has a developmental disability? There's a lot of reasons. Research for disability or not, we love to pay for research for children and very often not for adults. So there's a lot of discrepancies. The children's research might show a higher prevalence, adults might show a lower prevalence. The increase in autism spectrum disorders in the last decade, I can't even keep up with what the rate is anymore. And part of that is because we have changed the definition of what autism is, and some of that is because it actually is increasing as a diagnosis. And so when it changes literally every month, it's very difficult to keep up with what the prevalence might be. The one that stands out to me for why there are inconsistencies stands out to me because it shows the way that we still are oppressing people who have disabilities. That there's this idiosyncrasy with the way that we do the census, and it's termed the inmates of institutions can't be counted. But if you live in a group home, if you have a developmental disability and receiving services, chances are pretty high that you'll be living in a group home, which is a residential home in the community that is staffed, and you typically have between 5 and 8 people that live there. But if you live in a home that has between 5 and 8 people, that means that our government considers you to be an inmate of an institution, and you're not counted when the census comes around. Obviously, that's probably some legal something that needs to be shifted and has just been overlooked, but I think that it does highlight the way that our society is still oppressing people with disabilities, and it highlights the way that people with disabilities truly are marginalized like no other group of people. So what we do know is that disability is a lot more common in males. I usually ask questions to the audience at this point, but that is because of autism prevalence is significantly higher in boys than girls, and because traumatic brain injury before the age of 22 is a lot more common in males than in females. There's a lot of other considerations, like if you are living in poverty, you're more likely to have a disability. If you're from certain countries, you're a lot more likely to have a disability. And here are some of the causes. Again, this is all just kind of like we're just throwing our best effort out there to understand what we're talking about. So genetic means that the disability would have occurred no matter what. Unknown is where we still need a lot more research. And then environmental would be things like if you have fetal alcohol syndrome, or if you have what we used to call shaken baby syndrome, which is now called abusive head trauma. So it's not always the same reason. So what are the services and supports? The customer model on here is referencing that we have different ways of looking at disability. Sometimes we look at it through that the person is a customer and they're accessing services. Sometimes we look at it through a medical perspective, which is how I've been speaking to you so far, that you have a diagnosis and here is what those characteristics are and here's the treatment. So services and supports is pretty progressive in that it follows a customer model that we say you are the one that has this funding attached to whatever your diagnosis might be, and so how do you want to spend that funding? So now enter the community-centered boards. I'm going to go over this pretty quickly, but I think it's important because this is where you would go for assistance if you need assistance if somebody shows up with a disability in your agency. So Colorado is pretty unique in the way that we provide services, and we use something that we call CCBs. And this is because all the funding coming in through one single point at the state became overwhelming to the state. So they clustered together different groups of counties and identified the CCB, the community-centered board, which the funding goes to them, and then that board figures out who in their community, who in their counties has a disability, who's eligible for services, and what type of money they might access. So you can see the bottom line of people there is the people that are actually receiving the services. This is a map. This will also be in your handout. If you can find your region on there, then there's an attachment that you look up the number, and that will tell you what CCB is in your area. And the CCB would be a great resource for you. And the CCB can connect you to things like, primarily at the bottom, you see case management. That would be the very first place to start because that's a person that kind of has tabs on everything that's happening in the life of a person with a disability. And then they can connect you with all other types of services that might be able to help out a person that needs a change in where they live or needs a person to come that can work with them and help them through a hospital visit or help them through a court hearing. And now my favorite part, when we get to talk about disability through the social model. So the social model is my favorite part because it says that really people don't have disabilities. Really our society is disabled in that we're not set up to meet the needs of a vast variety of people. So for example, if you use a wheelchair and you go to get on the bus one day and the bus pulls up and the door opens and there's only steps, there's no ramp. That doesn't mean that you have a disability. You physically had the ability to get yourself there. It's that society isn't set up in such a way to have the infrastructure that helps you to navigate the world in the same way that people who don't have disabilities do. So this is where we talk about hidden disabilities. The people that I have worked with who have what we're calling hidden disabilities tend to be people that are not receiving services or not receiving adequate services for the support they might need. They tend to be people that are homeless or who are incarcerated. And it looks like from these statistics that a lot of people might have hidden disabilities. This number is 85%. So that means that we might be missing a large section of the population who would benefit from having some type of support simply because we don't see that phenotype, that characteristic, and so we don't ask any more questions. We just assume that that person is addicted to drugs or has mental illness, rather than getting curious and seeing if there is a different way that we can assist this person. So say that you work in whatever agency you're in and a person walks in. How do you know? If 85% of the disabilities are invisible, then how do you know? These are some of the forensic interviewing strategies that we have learned work. And yet usually a person won't say, yes, I have a developmental disability. They won't probably understand what you're asking them because we tend to not use that language, because at the point you're in the system, no one needs to, it's no longer relevant to talk about, do you have a disability? But what people will know is, do they have an IEP? That's a word they'd be very familiar with. Were they in special ed? Do you get support from, and Imagine is the Boulder and Broomfield County CCB, but this is where it's helpful to know your local area CCB. And if you are curious if a person might have a disability, you can just ask them, hey, do you ever, go to, and then insert the name of your CCB. You can check for cognitive processing by, this one's pretty basic, and I don't know how you would casually fit that into conversation, but you could ask, like, how many quarters make a dollar? You can ask them what time it is. You can ask for, typically things with numbers will highlight, or if you ask them to read something to you, you can typically tell if there is some delay in cognitive processing. You can ask them to relay events based on time in terms of past, present, and future. And if the person is avoiding eye contact with you, this is often a characteristic that tends to get people in difficult situations with law enforcement, because it appears to be either disrespectful or that the person just simply doesn't care. And so if the person is avoiding eye contact, that might be an indication of a developmental disability. This is an example of a forensic interview that the part where it said how many quarters are in a dollar, I think that would be very awkward to ask a person. So this man does a very good job of building rapport and talking with a person about what they do and what they like, and also getting a sense of time in terms of past, present, future. Sorry.
What do you like to drink with your lunch?
Coke.
Coke, huh?
Yeah.
Diet Coke or regular Coke?
No. I don't know, like, regular Coke, I can't. I like diet.
Diet Coke?
Yeah.
See, I like regular Coke.
I can't.
See, I don't drink coffee.
I do.
So I use the regular Coke for the caffeine to get me going in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it helps out a lot.
I drink coffee.
You drink coffee?
Yeah.
Do you drink it black?
Yeah.
How long have you drank coffee?
Second.
Yeah. See, I don't like the taste of coffee. It doesn't taste good to me.
You like Coke?
Coke.
So this man's doing a very good job of building rapport and talking with somebody about their likes and dislikes, which is important before you jump into the very difficult questions. And at the same time, he used it to kind of assess what the cognitive processing was. The response to how long have you drank coffee, and he said about a second, would indicate that he probably doesn't have good linear recollection, that he couldn't say this happened a week ago and this is going to happen tomorrow, which whenever somebody is in crisis and has had a crime committed against them, typically is very important for reporting. There are these other social emotional considerations that I think it's necessary and pertinent for us to address these and acknowledge these whenever we're looking at how to shift the system to become more trauma informed and disability aware. There's a really high occurrence of trauma in the disability community based upon institutionalization, which now for the most part is over, but many people that are in their late 40s, 50s, 60s. Yes.
We've got a question.
Oh, great. I love those.
So the question is, how does this identification process work for someone whose main disability is difficulty with social situations, such as Asperger's? Is it just the avoiding eye contact, question mark?
You're right. The avoiding eye contact would definitely be your primary indication that something's going on. Oftentimes, people who have a diagnosis of Asperger's have really good verbal skills. And so at this point, the point that you're curious about it, you could simply ask. You also, there's a cadence of speech that might also indicate. I hate to describe it this way, but it's a cadence of speech that almost sounds robotic. You'll notice that people might use, whenever they're talking about social scenarios or emotions, you'll notice that they might use scripts. Like a script might come up again like, oh, nice to meet you, or thank you for telling me that, or I had a very good time. And if they're repeating these short little snippets, these little phrases over and over again, and sometimes it seems like those phrases almost don't make sense, that would be an indication that a person might have that diagnosis. Also, in the way that they're speaking, they might be very concrete. So if you were leaving a room and you wanted to turn off the lights, you might say to them, hey, hit the lights, and they might literally hit the light switch rather than turn off the lights. So using some of those adages, the way that we kind of use language in a metaphorical imagery type way, if you notice that they don't quite understand what you're saying, then that also would be an indication. But you know, the best bet, especially if you suspect somebody has Asperger's, is in a very respectful and private way that is respecting their privacy, is simply just ask them. All right, thank you, Josh. And thank you for asking a question. I honestly love that. Okay, so back to trauma, unfortunately, jump right back in there. People with disabilities, there's a very high rate of being traumatized by living in institutions, and these are people that are alive right now. And then subsequently, we have ways of creating institutions, even if it's not the actual building of an institution. The disability system itself is a form of an institution. Living in a group home, you don't have very much choice or autonomy. That's a form of an institution. So being aware that having a trauma-informed environment is going to be very important if you're serving someone with a disability. The history of oppression for people with disabilities is overwhelming whenever I really read about it and research it and truly think about it. We have evidence, fossil evidence back to 10,000 BC that I won't go into too much for the sake of time, but there's fossil evidence from 10,000 BC that shows that we were ostracizing and murdering and injuring people who had disabilities. And you think, well, that's 10,000 BC, but you fast forward to 100 years ago and we were still putting people in asylums. And you fast forward to now, and we still have people on Twitter that are very regularly bullying people publicly on Twitter based upon their disability. Yeah, so the history of oppression is very important, and it contributes to that level of experiencing trauma. The history of education for children with disabilities, this is another way that our society shows that people with disabilities are separate and different. The placement of most of our special education classrooms is very often called the mobile, or called the annex, or it's the classroom at the back of the gym. We physically segregate children who have disabilities in order to educate them. And what this is doing, even if we're doing it for practical reasons, the implication is that all of the children who are in mainstream classrooms are getting this non-spoken, non-verbal communication to them that there is something separate and different about someone that has a disability. I mentioned the absence of control and autonomy. If you are receiving services, the chances are, if you have a moderate disability, the chances are that there's somebody who is assisting you, but probably for the sake of time, in a lot of circumstances, making decisions for you in terms of what you have for breakfast, if you get to have the sugary cereal or the not sugary cereal, if you attend art class or bowling class, when you get to see your friends, if you get to eat pizza for dinner. There's a lot of loss that goes along with having a disability and receiving those services and supports. And there's also a huge amount of grief. the grief is associated with high staff turnover, which is a very natural thing to happen. Oftentimes the direct line staff are people that are in college and they have a summer job or they have a part-time job while they're in college and then they move on. We don't pay the people who do this really difficult work. In some occasions, we don't pay them very well. So there's a lot of staff turnover. And very often what happens is that we use the word perseveration, that if a person who has a disability bonds with the staff and that staff leaves, and then the next staff keeps hearing about the old staff and keeps hearing about the old staff, then we say, you're perseverating on, let's say, Joe. You're perseverating on him. I already told you that he's, gone off somewhere. And then if that person continues to what is now been termed perseverate on that staff person, on that loss, on that true grief about the loss of a relationship, then it can escalate sometimes even to writing a behavior plan that if they continue to perseverate on that topic, then A, B, and C will happen. Also, if you're living in a group home with 5 to 8 people, a lot of whom probably are living in the group home because they need a lot of physical support and have a lot of physical challenges. It's a pretty common experience that an ambulance will pull up to your house in the middle of the night. One of the people that you had dinner with will get into that ambulance and will never come back. And we don't have the resources to train staff for themselves even how to deal with this type of grief and loss that comes with the death of someone that you're very intimate with. And we certainly aren't training staff how to support the people who live in that group home on how to deal with once a year or twice a year that somebody that they became friends with disappeared in an ambulance in the middle of the night. So these are growing areas for the disability service world. This is a very important one, and I think one that comes up most often in my interaction with people with disabilities. I keep saying I'm going to try and keep this fast. I'm not sure how fast it'll be. So negative identity development, obviously the opposite of that is positive identity development. And I'm going to give you kind of an anecdote to explain what I mean by this. And this is a true story about me. I'm from the South. I'm from Arkansas. And in Arkansas, you start to drive the tractors and the farm trucks when you are about 8 years old, literally. And so I never wanted to drive. I just wasn't interested. I thought it wasn't safe. And so I turned 14 when I could have gotten my permit, did not get my permit. I turned 16, could have gotten my license, didn't get my license. Then I was 17 and my mom said, you are getting in the car and we're going out to the rice fields and I'm teaching you to drive. And I didn't want to, I resisted it, but she told me I could do it, that I had the ability to do it. I was very good at these types of things. And we went out on the dirt roads and she taught me how to drive her stick shift Subaru Legacy. And I remember after some of the crying and some of the screaming that tends to happen with learning to drive, about 20 minutes later, there was a moment that it clicked and I was flying down those dirt roads. And in that moment, my teenager brain, my adolescent brain was wide open, was ready to receive the messages that I was going to give it about who I am in the world, about my beliefs about myself, if I think that I'm good or bad, if I'm competent or incompetent. And in that moment, I saw that my mom not only believed that I could do it, but she encouraged me to do it. She believed in me more than I did. She told me that I could do exactly what all of my peers were doing. And that became a part of who I am. It became a part of my identity that I still hold on to today. But if you reverse this story and say that I have a developmental disability, then what happens is I turn 14 and I see other kids at the school getting their permit and I ask about it and they tell me that's silly. And then I turn 16 and I see the other kids at the school getting their license and I ask about it and they say, we already talked about this. You can't, have this license. You can't do that. Stop perseverating on this. And then I turn 17 and I keep asking about it. And instead of being encouraged to go out and do something, this really important rite of passage in our culture, instead what I'm told is I'm given these messages that I'm not as good as my peers. I don't have the same rights. I don't have the same opportunities as my peers, as other people that I'm in school with, that I'm not safe to be out there. And if I learn to drive, I might hurt myself or worse, I might kill somebody. And that's one example, one moment in time of what it must be like to grow up with a developmental disability. Every single turn, you're told about what you can't do rather than what you can do. And all the while, your brain and your emotions are still wide open and ready to receive information, to receive messages about who you are. And so think about the series of hits that your identity takes based upon almost primarily being told everything you can't do. and now you're an adult and you're 50 years old, of course you're going to have negative self-talk. Of course you might be angry towards people. Of course you might not try to learn new skills because everybody has always told you that you can't. It's difficult to say these things to a group of people and not know the looks on your face. So I hope you guys are doing okay. Dual diagnosis is the disability world term for meaning that you have mental illness and you also have developmental disability. The purpose of this is just to know that for the people that you may be working with, that it might not just be the developmental disability that is contributing to interactions that you're having, that it might also be mental illness. The difference is dramatic. The general population, for the most part, it's about 10%. Everything that's different about humans, for the most part, I've found is about 10%. If you have a developmental disability, it's 30 to 40%. And the more research that we do, the more we're learning that number is actually pretty low. And the reason for this number being so high is not because people with developmental disabilities are more susceptible or naturally inclined to have mental illness. The reason that number is so high is because of negative identity development and oppression and grief and loss and all of these other social considerations that I talked about prior to this moment. And disability or not, if you were experiencing all of those things in life, of course you would probably get anxiety or feel depressed. And we don't really have the services out there that can address mental illness for people who also have developmental disabilities. So when I was working on the grant, we did a lot of focus groups and I did a lot of research and talking to a lot of people about, what is it that, about your life that makes you feel like you don't have power, that you can't speak up and say no, or you can't reach out and ask for help. And what we found was that it was this culture of compliance that the disability system has unintentionally created. This culture of compliance was the #1 factor that we found for people being at higher risk or being victims or survivors of any type of crime. And this culture of compliance, if you Google it, you most often get positive articles. The Harvard Business Review talks about how to build a culture of compliance in your company. But whenever you apply it to a disenfranchised and oppressed population, we're constantly asking people to comply and comply and comply. And at some point, compliance becomes sacrifice. And it becomes sacrifice of you willing to advocate for yourself, you willing to take care of, ask for what you need and keep yourself safe, because it's all for the sake of compliance. That if you say yes, and if you smile, and if you agree that you will go to art class, even though you actually want to go bowling, then that means that you get to have a pizza party with your friend on Friday. And we are teaching this type of compliance that is putting people at risk because they are acquiescing to every single outside stimulus and every single person that they perceive to have authority. Compliance is an important social skill. We're all taught in school that how to comply. A lot of you are complying right now by sitting at your computers and listening and downloading things later. That's all a version of compliance. But what we saw in the world of disabilities is that the level of compliance has become maladaptive, that it is now it's creating the at-risk of the at-risk adults. And that is something that we want to change. This is a different version of still talking about compliance. Dave Hingsberger, he wrote a lot about this in the 90s, that he's a mental health therapist that works with people with disabilities. And he noticed that there was a really high rate, before we did the research, he noticed there was a really high rate of people who were victims or survivors of sexual violence. And he got curious about it and started to do research and keep notes. And what he found was that this culture of compliance has created a system out of the best of intentions where the staff people are protecting the person with a disability from making decisions for themselves, protecting them from relationships, from society at large, and especially protecting them from sexual information. There's a lot more depth and richness to this particular concept that I don't have time to cover now, but you can Google it or you can contact me and we can go into it further. But it's this prison of protection that is putting people at risk for becoming victims of crime. So all of that, I know I spent the majority of the time talking about all of the social considerations leading up to it, but I think that it's important, I know that it's important to have a comprehensive understanding of what it must be like. I mean, we can only guess, to, you know, be in the disability system and have a developmental disability and be seen as less than and be told that you're not allowed to say no or you lose privileges. And all of those things contribute to the incredibly high rate of sexual violence against people with developmental disabilities. And as the title of the presentation says this, it's not a shock to you, but this number, the first time I read the study was about 10 years ago. And I didn't believe it. I made up all of the reasons that this was not a valid study, that this statistic didn't work, that maybe they asked the wrong people or they asked the wrong questions or they didn't understand what they were actually asking. And the reason that I had so much resistance to it is because this is horrifying, that my emotional self could not really swallow this as a reality. And what we're seeing is that this number, again, is actually probably low because it is so underreported. 83% of people in this particular, you know, subset of our culture are experiencing sexual violence, and only 3% of those abuse cases are being reported. Those numbers are outstanding. This will be on your statistics slide, so I'll skip over that. The perpetrators are, for those of you that this is your field, it's the typical list of perpetrators, people that you know. It's very often people that you know. The one that stands out and that is unique to people with developmental disabilities and the most common perpetrator are the paid caregivers. Again, this is something that when I learned it, it was very difficult for me to swallow this because by my role in the job that I do and that I love, this is who I am. And these are the people that I'm friends with. And I can't imagine being in a position of trust and taking advantage of it in that way. So this is similar to about a decade ago, whenever the Catholic Church was really under the microscope or under the magnifying glass about priests who were also had a high rate of being perpetrators. And it's the similar concept that it doesn't mean that people who work with disabilities are naturally by some inherent quality going to be perpetrators. It means that people who have really terrible intentions have read our culture and read our society, and they can tell where the people are who are most at risk. And they're at risk not because of who they are, not because of their disability. They're at risk because of this prison of protection. They're at risk because we've told them that they're terrible people and they can't do things on their own or make their own decisions. And the people that want to be perpetrators see that, and they gain positions where they have access to a population that has been so disenfranchised that they now are at high risk for being victims and survivors of sexual violence. There's a lot here. I want to kind of pay attention to the time. So this isn't separate and different. If you have a disability and you survive this type of crime, a lot of the information and the facts are going to be the same. And then there are also these additional factors. And the additional factors are that a person has access to your life in the way that they wouldn't if you didn't have a disability. For example, leaving someone unclothed where others can see. This probably can only happen if you are in a position that you need personal care and that you have a trusted person that's providing you that type of care. The concept of the other abuser at the bottom of the slide is referring to how we shame people. Well, we do this in our society at large as well, but especially if you have a developmental disability, we shame any type of sexual behavior. And we can do this in such a way, and there's a lot more information in this, but we can do this in such a dramatic way that it actually traumatizes the person, and that they're no longer willing to even look at their own bodies or touch their own bodies or experience pleasure because we have told them that their bodies are bad things. So what are some of the tactics that these perpetrators are using? It's, as I said, the similar tactics that most perpetrators would use, the grooming, for example. But there's also this additional list of things like exploiting the culture of compliance, exploiting that idea that you won't say no because you're afraid that you might lose your home, or you might not get your meds, or you might not get your next meal if you say no to this person that's asking for something that you don't want to do. People that are in these positions of power, for the paid caregivers, they can withhold adaptive equipment. They can take advantage of the lack of sexual education and present it as if this is a typical thing that should be happening. They can misuse medications in that they can withhold a medication that a person might need, or they can give them too much so that the person is incapacitated. They can exploit the lack of access to really the community in general, to police services, medical services. They can minimize, they can say, oh, they have that bruise because they fell down, because you know how they are, they're always stumbling and falling. And then other staff members are like, oh yeah, they're always stumbling and falling. And so they can minimize it and blame it on the characteristic of having a disability. And the most important one, and the one that happens very often, is they exploit the fact that people with disabilities aren't believed. And so even if a person with the disability is reporting to maybe their day program staff or their case manager or their mom, and that person, you know, takes it to the next step and asks a question about it, all it takes is saying, oh, they don't understand that, you know, what that word means. They don't understand what that part of the body is. They don't understand what sex is. And so they can exploit the fact that people aren't believing the actual reports that are occurring.
We've got another question, Caitlin.
Yeah. Yes.
How can friends or family help someone who has a developmental disability and is engaging in some high-risk sexual behaviors with others where consent may not be able to be present due to their disability?
I feel like there was a lot of sections to that question. Will you ask it one more time?
Yes. How can friends or family help someone who has a developmental disability and is engaging in some high-risk sexual behaviors with others where consent may not be able to be present due to their disability?
Oh, you are asking the unanswerable question. You're asking the question about consent. Well, there's two pieces to this question. So you're asking about high-risk sexual behavior. And what we'll talk about some in the next slides, and what I've already talked about, is that a lot of times that high-risk sexual behavior isn't because they have a disability. It's because they haven't been given access to sexual information or sexual education. So they don't actually acknowledge or recognize or comprehend the high-risk nature of it. Or for some other reason, they have some type of mental illness, and this is a symptom of that type of mental illness. But then you add in the layer of consent. And in my longer version of this presentation, actually I have a Glee video that I show about a woman who has Down syndrome dating a man who does not have a disability. And we discuss if consent is possible in that scenario. And consent is one of the most elusive topics that we ran into in our years of working on this grant and doing research. We learned that this is the Colorado's definition, is that you have to understand the nature of sexual activity, you have to comprehend the motives of another person, and you have to somehow be determined that you are giving this sexual activity as being given freely. If we apply that to somebody that doesn't have a disability, I couldn't answer these questions for myself. I don't know in some moments, in some states, if I do understand the true nature of sexual activity. I think none of us really could be very clear about that for ourselves. So whenever you're talking about two people who have, it sounds like, who both have developmental disabilities and are engaging in high-risk behaviors, we can't just jump to the conclusion that consent isn't possible. Maybe consent is not possible given all of the factors that are present. Maybe the person hasn't really been in a situation that they can learn what sexual activity is or what the consequences might be, or not even about like sexual activity, but even what a relationship might be and how relationships can hurt and what are your responsibilities in a relationship. And all of these things can be taught in classes that are showing up more and more, that are sexual expression, sexual education, and relationship foundations, classes that are specifically designed for people who have developmental disabilities. So before you, and without knowing more details, I can't answer very specifically, but before you take that path of these people can't give consent, I would make sure that all of these other checkboxes are checked off, that they have been given the opportunity to learn about relationship and learn about sexual information. And then once all those things are checked off, then you can start to look at, okay, but is consent still not possible? And if you have more specific details, also feel free to email me and we can problem solve that as well. All right. All right, I promise we're going to get through this in 10 minutes. That's my plan. So the barriers to reporting, why is it only 3% of this 83% that we're hearing about? There's the typical barriers. Since 60-something% of you guys work in the field, I'm going to skip over that because you know the typical barriers, and usually it's because of victim blaming and shame. But if you have a developmental disability, there are even additional barriers. the primary that stands out is that you might lose your house. You might immediately report the person who is your paid caregiver, who is your host home provider, which then it's not too far of a leap to realize that means now you don't get to live in your home anymore. You don't get to be in your neighborhood or have the same neighbors that maybe you like. The dependence on the caregivers, that it's pretty scary to report somebody who is the person who's feeding you and giving you medications and driving you to where you want to be. A lot of times people with disabilities don't fully understand their rights. This seems like a simple thing to understand, but whenever we live in this society where we're putting that special ed classroom in the mobile building behind the school, that's indicating to not only to the kids in the other classrooms, but to the kid that has a disability, that's saying the rights that everybody don't apply to you. And so you become an adult and you know that things are happening to you that you don't want to happen, but you assume that's just your plight in life because that's the messages you've been given for your entire childhood, is that the same rules don't apply to you. MAIN is this one in the middle that stands for mistreatment, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. This is the mandate that is placed upon anybody that works at a disability agency if they are working with people who are termed by the law to be at-risk adults, meaning they have a disability, or there's other criteria if you are an elder. But if you're an at-risk adult and they suspect that anyone has mistreated, abused, neglected, or exploited you in any type of way, then we immediately are required to report to police, law enforcement, immediately within the hour that you suspect this or that this has been disclosed to you. So people with developmental disabilities, they're in the system. They know that incident reports are written for something as simple as stubbing your toe. So it's going to be pretty clear to them if something a lot larger has happened, that it's not really safe to go to your staff person and say, the person that I live in their house and they feed me meals committed this crime against me, because immediately all of their power is going to be stripped away because this system, the gears of the system, the well-meaning system that wants to keep people safe and therefore wants the law enforcement to be informed, has now, by that that good intention, has now stripped all of the power away from this person that already has so little control in their life. And for people that have reported previously, or people who maybe do show some type of sexual behavior, highly sexualized behavior, it's pretty common that we hear the term false allegation. The word allegation comes up because a MAIN report is technically called a MAIN allegation. So if you work in the disability system, the concept of disclosure doesn't really exist. Everything is an allegation. Even if the person with the disability is just trying to cry or say that they're upset about something, it suddenly becomes an allegation. And then a few steps down the road of seeing people with disabilities not as credible witnesses or credible reporters, or their sometimes misrepresentation of linear time, for a lot of different reasons, for their lack of sexual vocabulary, a lot of times it very quickly can be turned into a false allegation, or the perception of a false allegation.
We have another question, Caitlin.
Yes.
How does Colorado define having the mental capacity to give consent?
I have tried to find the answer to that, and I haven't found the answer to that. Many times, there's no particular screening. There's no particular test. The screening that exists identifies you as having a developmental disability, and at the point that you've been identified that way, it doesn't automatically imply that you don't have the mental capacity to give consent. So what usually happens is that you end up in front of a judge, and a psychologist comes in, and your mom comes in, and maybe one of your day program staff comes in, and they testify. And usually the people that are testifying probably don't want you to be able to give consent. They want to be able to make decisions for you because they're trying to keep you safe, but we see the problems with that. And then that judge determines if that person has the mental capacity. It's a very flawed system. Very often, I would say probably 90%, 90+% of the time, that judge has no information or education or background for working with people with developmental disabilities and knowing some of the communication nuances and cognitive nuances.
We also had somebody just ask if you could repeat what the acronym MAIN stands for.
Yes. Mistreatment, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And it's called a MAIN allegation. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to get through this, guys. So some of the other barriers are that whenever you call a crisis hotline, the people who are working the crisis hotline are given a lot of training, because awful people out there are doing awful things, like calling the crisis hotline when they aren't in crisis, just to say terrible things, or to breathe heavily, or to say sexualized things to the person on the other end. So they're trained to identify, some places are still trained to identify inappropriate callers. And that inappropriate caller behavior, the characteristics, the checklist, very often is the same behavior that a person who has a developmental disability who calls a hotline might also demonstrate. For example, they might figure out how to, they might have seen the number, or they might have had a friend dial it for them. And at the point that the phone is answered and this person is on the other end that they can't see, they might not say anything at all, or they might need a lot more processing time than the person receiving the call knows that they need. And so a delay of 10 seconds for that person might just be them getting their thoughts together. But by the time that 10 seconds is up, the person who received the call has termed it an inappropriate caller and hung up the phone. There's also alternative communication styles, simply not being understood whenever you're on the phone, or needing a talk box that doesn't translate to the telephone, or communicating through nonverbal behaviors like facial expressions and gestures, or even sign. And then in general, people not being viewed as, I put sexual beings in here because I think we all are coming from the place that we know this isn't about sex, but it gets convoluted whenever a person with disabilities isn't even viewed as a sexual being. Then it exacerbates that thought of, well, why would somebody commit this type of crime against them? And so then it turns into a false allegation, or thinking that the person doesn't know what they're reporting. So that was all the terrible stuff. And what we learned is how to fix some of that. We can't fix everything, but we learned a lot of skills to fix a lot of it. So the way that we did that is we looked at the culture of agencies. We did the project where we were looking at the CCB, which was the Disability Agency, and then the local Rape Crisis Center. And we looked at how are we going to break this down? Like, how are we going to tease apart what's going on here and what needs to change? So we turned it into 3 environments: the physical environment, the communication information environment. This means like Facebook and email and any brochures that you might have and information that you're putting out on Twitter. And then the attitudinal and programmatic environment. We discovered the attitudinal environment is a very also elusive thing to identify. And so we noticed that if we look at policies and procedures, and if we look at actual programs, the options for programs and services, that gave us kind of like a direct information about what the attitude of the organization might be. And then we found that there are some really obvious barriers in these particular environments. The really obvious ones for physical barriers, when we were running one of our first kind of assessments, we went to the local Rape Crisis Center with somebody who uses a motorized wheelchair, and she literally could not get through the door. The door was too narrow. And then we went to another section where she could go into a vestibule, and then she was trapped in the vestibule, that the one door closed behind her, the outside door closed behind her, but there wasn't enough room in the vestibule for her to move her wheelchair back to open the inward swinging door to get actually into the Rape Crisis Center. And that was, we all had a good laugh about that because, we were there for good proactive reasons and we were supportive of each other. But it was an aha moment for us about how far we truly have to go if we literally can't even get through the door. Transportation, I'm going to click back. Transportation is a huge challenge for people who have developmental disabilities, not just in context of accessing services, but in context of accessing their lives. Information and communication barriers, that there's not a lot of adaptive equipment at rape crisis centers or domestic violence shelters. There's a lack of interpreters. Everything is pretty much written for people that have cognitive processing that is the mainstream type of cognitive processing. There's not a lot of like even images out there that indicate to somebody that has a disability that that agency might be for them, because all the pictures that they see on all the written materials, if they can't read the written materials, they're just seeing pictures of people who don't appear to have developmental disabilities. We talked about inappropriate callers, and just that disability agencies historically have been pretty separate and unknown to the rest of the community. And we're working very hard to change that. We don't want to see ourselves as separate and different anymore. We want to be integrated and become a part of the community. And so we're working to change that. And then the programmatic and attitudinal barriers is lack of even information about being trauma informed and what disability aware might mean. A ton of policies and procedures, some of which we can't change, like the main allegation policy, were barriers. Lack of staff knowledge, their training, their skill, the typical things. So again, that was still on the side of maybe what's not exactly going right, but then we started to figure out how to fix some of these things, and we had to identify what was wrong in order to figure out how to make it right. This is also Dave Hingsberger. He identified that the opposite of the prison of protection, a system and services and programs and attitudes that create the prison of protection, we can flip it over and actively start to break down the walls of that prison of protection and create safety. And we can do that by providing sexual education, by teaching people in very intentional ways that rights that apply to the general society also apply to them. One of the things that case managers do whenever they have their annual meetings with the person who has a disability is they hand them a written page that has all of their rights listed on it. And it says, your rights. And we were talking with somebody who had one of these handouts, and this person was, we talked about it for a while, and this person said, oh, but these are your rights. See right there, it says your rights. They're not my rights. And this person didn't have the ability to read very well, and it was all in written form. So an outcome of this project is that we changed it to say my rights and put a place to put the person's picture, and then we also made visual alternatives to all of the written information. They have options for healthy relationships. Whenever you don't have transportation, this is very difficult to find really any time to socialize. They are valued whenever they don't comply. We teach non-compliance. We teach people to say no. We teach people to be the bossy one. We teach people to be even the annoying one as long as they are doing it to take care of themselves. They had somebody in their life that really listened, that asked questions, that didn't jump to conclusions about false allegations. They had a healthy self-concept. They had a lot of people in their lives telling them that they could do things and they could achieve more than they had. And they had privacy awareness. Whenever we are about 4 years old in our culture and we go to the bathroom, our moms or dads usually say, oh, you need to close the door, that's private. If you have a developmental disability and you're 10 years old and you go to the bathroom and try to close the door, very often the message that you're given is you need to leave the door open, it's not safe, I need to know what you're doing in there. And given that message from the time that you're very young, it makes sense that we have a lot of adults out there that don't have a sense of privacy awareness, that don't know that it's not okay for their body to be exposed in a public setting, because that's the message that they've been given, that's what they were taught. All right, I have one more poll, if you guys are still there. Josh, would you launch the poll for us?
Absolutely.
I'm not going to talk over this poll because I want you to be able to really think about it. And I recognize that I am significantly over time. For those of you that do need to get to your next meeting or need to go, this is being recorded so you can have access to the information afterwards. All right, Josh, could you read the results to me?
Absolutely. 31% says yes. 39% says close to it. 20% not sure. 10% no.
That's great. That's great. I've noticed a lot of shifts that have been happening, especially in Colorado in the last years, and I'm really happy to hear that things maybe are moving in the right direction. So these last slides are really like about the reviewing some of the practical skills and then highlighting the handouts that will be the practical skills that you will receive from email. And if you would like any additional training or information, I can give a training literally just on how to interview somebody that has a developmental disability. So if you would like any of that, please contact me and let me know. So things to keep in mind. Inappropriate caller might not always be an inappropriate caller. Sometimes people need a lot of time to wait and process. And there might be some disorganized descriptions or descriptions that are lacking accurate sexual vocabulary. The culture of compliance means that a lot of people who have grown up and live in this culture if they don't know the answer, they might just default to yes. If you ask a question, they just nod because they have learned that makes them appear to be agreeable. Echolalia is the characteristic of it is whenever you repeat the words that you just heard. So it's very easy to lead somebody into reporting something or disclosing something that they didn't intend to if they have echolalia. So an example would be if I said to someone, do you want to have pizza or hamburgers for dinner? And they would say hamburgers for dinner. And so you have to get curious whenever you're talking to someone if you recognize that type of speech pattern and ask the same question multiple times in different ways to discern it from echolalia. Acquiescence is a symptom of being highly compliant and just agreeing with the person in the room that they perceive to have the most power and authority. Concept of time may not be linear, so it might sound very disorganized, or it might sound like they're reporting something that didn't actually happen, but it's more likely their concept of time. And then here's some of the tools for application that we will send out to you. There's a person first language handout. This is just, it's not identity first, but that's because it's kind of the industry standard of best practices to use person first language. But I think it's important to be aware that some people prefer identity first language and ask them if you notice that they're using language differently. We won't send anything out about ADA because that would be a book of about 1 million pages. But just, you know, keep ADA in mind and make sure that your doors are wide enough for somebody to get in the door. Universal design is principles about all of us at one point in our life will experience some type of disability. For example, this spring, I broke my arm. And whenever I broke my arm, I was really grateful for those buttons with the blue buttons at the door that you push and make the door open on its own, so I could still carry my things and go into the door. That's universal design. It's not separate and different. It's design that's made for every single person in every single state. And then we have physical and emotional safety criteria. These are lists we came up on the grant project. That's just questions to ask yourself while you're looking at your agency or thinking about your agency, and see if you really are trauma informed and disability aware. Disability etiquette, that's a beast to go through. Again, I can give separate trainings on that if you would like, but I have a handout for it as well. Interview strategies looks a lot like behavioral strategies. That would be an additional training as well if you're interested. It kind of looks at how do you help guide somebody without leading somebody, and how do you understand whenever somebody is not using cognitive concepts like linear time. And then the list of community center boards with all of the contact information on that. I'm going to skip. These are an example of some of the interview strategies: how to develop rapport, how you might outline what you're going to be doing, how to use affirmative words. I won't go into detail about that for the sake of time, but know that there's more information to be had there. This is all of the principles of universal design. And just 23 minutes over, I made it to the end. This is my contact information. Again, I'm at the ACL, the Association for Community Living, the ARC serving Boulder and Broomfield counties. And before I wrap up, I'm curious if there are any more questions.
There is one that just came through, and the question is, are materials being presented also in Braille for visually impaired and blind individuals, and are they put in a manner that is on their comprehension level? And then a follow-up specifying the general materials that are given to anyone in crisis.
The materials that we have, we don't have the financial resources to put them in Braille, but they are formatted, and this is something that maybe not everybody knows. I learned it through the process of this project a while, years ago, that even when you just open a Word document, if you use the like the standard templates that give you headings, like heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, if you format using that, it takes some of your creative control away from the document, but it means that a screen reader can read it. If it's just text that's not formatted, then a screen reader can't read it. So the handouts that we created through the Intersections grant, they are set up that a screen reader can read it. They are not adapted with visuals, but I can point you towards the right programs to use. There's one called Boardmaker that could help you adapt it. Most of it is designed to be directed towards the staff rather than the people that are there to access services. But again, always reach out to me and I can help you with whatever specifics you might have. Okay, are there any other questions, Josh?
No, that's all the questions that have come through. So I just want to thank you again for all of this great information, Caitlin, and I want to thank everybody who was in attendance with us today for this webinar, and just let everybody know that there's a survey at the end of the webinar. If you could please take that. Your feedback is very valuable to us. And also look out for the follow-up email that will have the handouts, PowerPoint, and a link to the recorded version of this video. Anything else you would like to share, Caitlin?
I just want to express my gratitude for everybody showing interest and listening, and please reach out to me if you need anything at all.
Wonderful. Hope everyone has a wonderful day. Take care.